I'm going to talk about Boschan translation, and I even brought some visual aids, and then I'll talk about my own translation work. It's very interesting to note that this was one of the first books to appear in English translation, his biography of King David, which is basically a biblical reading that seems to assume that King David in the Bible was a historical character. Now, it's been shown that he wasn't. You know, that there's only one slight evidence, a stele, of some local ruler named David, you know, and, but more than that, there's nothing. The books about David were written in several hundred years after his supposed existence. So we have to look at this book, you know, as an interesting work of biblical exegesis, right? And as such, it is almost a metaphor, I would say, for Juan Bosch himself, because he starts out talking about how the people of Judea were oppressed and they needed a leader to lead them out of that oppression. So immediately I thought, so that must explain somewhat his interest, because he wrote this in Spanish in 1963 while he was still president, you know, for the 9-month period. Where he was elected president of the Dominican Republic beginning in 1962. And this was published in Britain by Chatto and Windus. And it's interesting if you look at the paratext that the ads for the books are by distinguished scholars like M.I. Finley, you know, the scholar of ancient history, and Petrarch and His World by Morris Bishop. And so this biography of King David was inserted into very distinguished antiquarian company, but I think we should read it as a kind of metaphorical book. The analysis is terrific of the Bible. I mean, he's very imaginative, and he uncovers all the discrepancies between you know, various biblical retellings. Also, there is the unfinished, what is called in English, The Unfinished Experiment, Democracy in the Dominican Republic. Well, the original title, and I speak as a translator here, is Crisis de la Democracia de América en la República Dominicana. That is not what this is saying, you know. The unfinished experiment. It's almost like, you know, Rosie, sort of, you know, it's like, it'll finish at some point, but democracy in the Dominican Republic. Not America, mind you, as in the original title, but in the Dominican Republic. So that, I think, is very interesting because it was also published by Prager. And Prager, as some of you probably know, was financed by the CIA. You know, that many books that Prager published were done through the auspices of the CIA. So kind of ironic that this comes out in 1965, around the time of the coup, but it's written in 1963. So, you know, around the time that Bosch was thrown out. It's a very good account. It's wrongly out of print. It should be reprinted in English. It's also interesting because since before I knew this book was still available in translation, I was translating The Social Composition of the Dominican Republic, which only brings us up to 1930, to the advent of Trujillismo. But the social structure of the Dominican Republic kind of, it's a prequel. I would say it takes up where it leaves off, but that would be to defy the movement of time that we're putting Bosch into. So, you know, very interesting book in a lot of ways. But I think one of the books that most marked, and is the most impossible to find, of Juan Bosch's work in English is Pentagonism, a substitute for imperialism, by, and it's published by Black Cat Books, the same publishers, a division of Grove Press that published Malcolm X's autobiography, Che Guevara's reminiscences of the Revolutionary War, and Revolution in the Revolution, question mark, by Regis Debray. So, and it was published in that year, 1968, which was quite transcendental. This was written, of course, the year before, and it was translated by Helen R. Lane, who translated works by Goitisolo, Vargas Llosa, Octavio Paz. So this was like an A-list translator writing this. But this was the last book of Bosch, except for a couple of short stories and anthologies that appeared in English until the social composition of the Dominican Republic. Why is that, you might think? Well, because what is in here is a very thoroughgoing denunciation of American policy. And I just wanted to very, very briefly make a note of where he's talking about Pentagonism. I'm not so sure it was a substitute for imperialism, but it was certainly an extension of imperialism. Imperialism doesn't hold simply in the 19th century. It evolves too, along with the empires. So Pentagonism, it kind of reminded me of a much earlier text, which is the Fábula del Tiburón y las Sardinas by Juan José Arévalo, another politician whose country, Guatemala, was sorely impacted and continues to be by the overthrow spearheaded by the CIA of the Jacobo Arbenz government. And so these two books kind of go together, and they merit a comparative analysis in that they're both by political leaders of their respective countries. But there's a certain amount of, let's say, exposure of, he basically says that Vietnam and the Dominican Republic, as the distinguished scholar just told us, they went together, in a lot of ways, the American interventions. And he says that what the U.S. did in the Dominican Republic in '65 influenced what it did in Vietnam, in the intensification of the war. So, in fact, Ellsworth Bunker, who was the ambassador to the Dominican Republic, was also the ambassador to South Vietnam thereafter. So, you don't need to be a conspiracist to see a certain continuity. So, so Pentagonism, I don't really see that as much of a concept, but the book itself is extremely eloquent, and it has not been reprinted. Copies are impossible to find online except at very exorbitant prices, and you think, yes, because this is a thoroughgoing denunciation, and very eloquently written. And it also talks about, and this is important for Dominican studies in the United States, its translation also mentions the attack on the Matun, for instance, which I didn't know about, right? I mean, there's, where many people were killed, woman who spoke earlier about all the people tortured and killed, he is mentioning all that in here, that Ahora, the paper that published, the offices of Ahora, which published this book in its original Spanish, were torched by basically a mob. People, they were hardware stores were blown up. Hundreds of men were brutally tortured, and this is. This brings it all home, because if you look at the Phoenix Project in Vietnam, it was kind of similar, So again, the continuities. But most of my translations, and I speak here as a translator, are literary. So it was very interesting to embark upon a translation of something that is historical sociology. That is not something I'm especially used to doing. But I thought, because of the very importance of Juan Bosch, and that it was work worth doing. And I also learned a great deal, needless to say. And as a scholar of Caribbean literature, I am actually very much in favor of a regional emphasis beyond linguistic and geographical frontiers. And I felt a certain responsibility to do this. Juan Bosch, for me, was an important contemporary during the post-war period of a lot of other important Caribbean intellectuals in the era of decolonization. I'm thinking, for example, of the Martinican Aimé Césaire, who continued writing poetry, although Bosch stopped writing fiction when he dedicated himself fully to politics. The Puerto Rican Pedro Albizu Campos, the Jamaican Norman Manley, the Barbadian Grantley Adams, and the Trinidadian Eric Williams. And probably one reason why Bosch's capacious history of the Caribbean from Christopher Columbus to Fidel Castro has not been translated into English is because Eric Williams got there first, from Columbus to Castro. It's like, well, you want two books with the same, with the same title, right? And whether or not one approves of the synoptic, single-authored history of the Caribbean is another matter. But I think we need to have a synchronic perspective on the Caribbean. Instead of restricting our intellectual horizons according to languages and colonial inheritances, which mostly enclose us in identitarian jails and outdated nationalisms that are very separate and very removed from the universal humanism that Juan Bosch exemplified. And the important thing is to go beyond this geopsychic and geophysical fragmentation that the Barbadian poet Kamau Brathwaite considers to be an endemic ill of the region. And this was a learning experience for me because I knew very little except for some literary contributions of the Dominican Republic. I knew some names like Maximo Gomez and Juan Pablo Duarte, and I knew about the North American military occupation. I knew about the dictatorship of Chapitas, right, Trujillo. And I remember his assassination. I was a boy then, but I remember seeing it all over the papers that, this guy named Trujillo was assassinated. And you're like, I'm 7 years old, and it's like, whoa, what the hell? Not knowing that 2 years later, in 1963, I won't go on. But, and I knew about the invasion of the island in '65 by Lyndon Johnson and his Marines. But I didn't know anything about the formation of social classes, the specific historical development, the longue durée of the Dominican Republic. And so it was really with a lot of curiosity that I started. And in technical terms, I followed the method of the great translator Gregory Rabassa. He never read the stuff that he translated before translating. He started at the beginning and kept on going. And that's what I did, pretty much. I tried to maintain, to the best of my ability, Juan Bosch's talent as a storyteller, right? So I tried to keep that literary focus in, although sometimes the very long quotations and the fact that he spells out numbers like 20,000, he spells it out, 20,550, you spell it out, you don't put it in numbers. So that was kind of, daunting. But I didn't want to go into a kind of, what shall I say, a kind of translationese. I wanted to make it readable. And one thing I had to do is I had to look into certain words that were very specific to not only to the discipline of historical analysis, but also to the flora and specific Dominican traits of style. Because one of the traps you have when you're a translator is you think there is only one or two given definitions for a single word, right? I had many reviews and comments from the editor, Dan Shapiro, and also from, I revised it myself, and I remember telling Dan, who was the editor of the series, I really don't want you to get ahead of me in matters of corrections, So in the end, I finished this translation with a great respect for Juan Bosch's intellectual integrity, right? Even when he speaks in this text of his bitter enemy Trujillo and his bloody regime, he never falls into any kind of facile polemics. He prefers to follow Spinoza's model. You don't laugh, neither to laugh nor to cry, but to understand. I was also impressed with his refusal of what was then the consensus of Dominican historians of vituperating Haiti and the literally leyenda negra of the supposed wreckage caused by the domination of General Boyer on the eastern eastern region of La Española, something that needs to be remembered today. And so as I conclude this, I'm hoping that this book still, for Anglophone readers, I hope that it promotes a better comprehension of the very complex Dominican history, because we don't have that kind of knowledge in the American Academy so much, at least in the Anglophone Academy. So I think it's very important to read this. It is not history. It is not history from the bottom up. It's historical sociology. So at times it gets dry, but I can't tell you how much I learned from it. And this is really the reason why I translate. To translate is to learn. To translate is to learn. And to translate is also to make sure that people in your language know of the major contributions to knowledge of the people in other languages, especially somebody like Juan Bosch, who has been unjustly treated by the American literary and scholarly establishment. So thank you very much for listening.